I'm grateful to the organizers of IACCP Golden Jubilee International Congress 2022 for inviting me to speak on this occasion. I have a long connection with the IACCP. I attended the third Congress of IACCP held in Tilburg in 1976, and since then have been attending most of the congresses, but lately I have missed some in the last decades. I thought what I should share on this occasion, and then decided that the best thing is to share what we have observed as evolving in the IACCP. There are many kinds of developments, and those developments take many dimensions, and it would be very difficult for anyone to cover all. So what I thought I should focus on the developments which have taken place related to indigenous psychology, cultural psychology, and particularly with reference to India. As we all know, India has been a very active participant in the IACCP conferences, and in terms of participation of scholars, the number have increased over the years. Let me begin with our background, national background. We were a colonial country till 1947. And the educational system in the country was planned by the colonizers. In our case, they were British. And for British, the education was an instrument to serve their purpose, to make them efficient as a ruler. The educational system of India, crafted in a very systematic manner in mid-19th century, was based on one British scholar and intellectual of the colonization period, Macaulay. Macaulay argued that the purpose of education was to form or to produce a class in India who may be interpreters between us, the British, and the millions whom we govern, they govern, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and intellect. So that was the mission, British mission, to develop higher education system in this country. The foundation of the first university, that is Calcutta University, was based on this principle. Well, after independence, The questions were raised on the system, but during the colonial period, the system was so much rooted and so much existed on the ground that it was difficult to develop a new parallel system in a systematic manner. The colonial period also received some kind of reaction to the system. And many scholars argued that the colonial system is not appropriate for education in the country, but it existed, it continued. After independence, psychologists, particularly those who were interested in understanding the socio-economic reality and those who wanted to contribute in development process, they realized that the imported system and imported psychology was not good for application. It was not appropriate to apply knowledge and theory as it is to understand the local problem, to understand the local context, and positively make intervention. Those limitations have been argued in many ways. There are the dominant stance that laws and theories of Euro-US psychology are universal, have been challenged, and more forcefully in the last 5 decades by many, particularly by cross-cultural, cultural, and indigenous psychologists, on the ground that all psychologies mostly represent cultures in which they arise and develop. So how the psychology which developed in Euro-American context can be whole hog applied in Indian context, that was the real issue. Since the colonial period, there has been intellectual tradition, and also in other countries there have been similar tradition to question the value of Western knowledge system for understanding social and psychological phenomena and usefulness in resolving related problems. This kind of concern led to efforts of decolonizing knowledge and for decolonizing psychology. For example, some of the concerns shown by scholars of India, I would like to mention. Philosopher Bhattacharya vigorously argued that we cannot accept blanket imposition of imported ideas. He argued for Swaraj, self-rule in ideas. Ideas should not be imposed. Ideas should evolve in the context a scholar is located. Anthropologist S.C. Dubé argued that to decolonize theories and methods should be our priority. And sociologist Jogendra Singh, he argued that social conditioning of knowledge requires that we develop our own indigenous knowledge about human nature. Another sociologist, Yogesh Atal, argued that indigenization should be the voice. We should try to develop indigenous knowledge against the implantation of perpetuating captivity of mind. Cultural contextualization was thought to be the most concerned issue for Indian scholars. Even the postmodernists argue that social psychology realities are socially and culturally contextualized, and therefore, accordingly, that should be studied. Cultural and indigenous psychologies are required for meaningful cross-cultural comparison. We cannot have comparative study, we cannot have cross-cultural studies unless all the concerned societies which are involved in such kind of comparative studies are studied in indigenous way. We cannot compare certain social psychological phenomena, certain psychological processes, unless we have some knowledge about the societies and culture from which population are drawn. So, existence and maturity of cross-cultural psychology depends on how much indigenous knowledge we have about the societies concerned which are included in the comparative study. In this process, one major movement of cultural psychologists have also come up, and they argue that culture and individuals are not separable. We generally in psychology, we study individual, but we cannot separate the individual from the culture. And therefore, when we are involving individuals to study them in our cross-cultural comparison, then we must have some knowledge about individuals in their own cultural context. Thus, culture exists inside the individuals, shapes the individual, and the way knowledge is experienced and integrated in the individual, that has to be understood in the context and from which individuals are drawn for their study. All the above argument, all these suggestions have led to the conclusion that for matured cross-cultural study, we need to have knowledge about people, and that knowledge has to be in the context of their culture. In 1988, I edited 3 volumes on based on survey of psychological research in India. And I arrived at the following conclusion. Number one, psychology in India requires outgrowing from the alien framework, from the culture-bound framework, and from the process of blind adaptation of the Western-based psychology. Evolution of culturally appropriate methodology and psychological assessment are required. Psychology needs to be rooted in its own philosophical system, value system, thoughts, and tradition. Accepting new approaches like cross-cultural, cultural, and indigenous psychologies must not be abrupt. It has to be a gradual process. So probably cultural and indigenous psychology should come first, followed by cross-cultural psychology. Application of psychology for change and development, and then probably we will be able to successfully use psychological knowledge for change and development. Gradually, indigenous psychology in India developed. I started developing. The process began in 60s, and I quote Professor Sinha, who called the fellow psychologist in India to indigenize the discipline. The call for indigenization inspired psychologists to go beyond the reactive phase, and so the results of conducting research in the societal context, representing social system, tradition, beliefs, values, and ideologies. Indigenization is not a narrow parochialism. It has to be very broad, and we must not jump to make loud claims. The process has to be well thought and well argued and well presented. It must facilitate development of a mature discipline. So it cannot be one or two sort of activities. It has to be a process, stages should be followed for its development. Then probably we will develop mature indigenous science, and it will have acceptability if we follow the process. There has been a worldwide concern. It is just not India where indigenization issue got the priority. Other colonial countries have gone through the same experiences. And the Euro-American psychology was so developed that it was imported and at best adapted locally in the educational system. For example, Uchal Kim argued for psychological knowledge that has to be native. A very enthusiastic person, Enriquez of Philippines in 80s, I think he expired a little early. He argued that the movement is against a psychology that perpetuates the colonial status of the Filipino mind. John Adair, a Canadian, he also talked about indigenization. He has done many studies to evaluate the progress of indigenization. He talked about that it has to be a gradual process, and he argued blending of imported discipline to unique element within that culture. Many people question Professor Adair's position, but he thought that it is a blending process rather than a whole hog new psychology emerging in a new context. Professor Sinha himself argued that it has to develop in stages. Then the perspective on indigenization in our context requires some greater understanding. In Indian context, indigenization has been undertaken following not a particularly a standard procedure or some well accepted stages have not been adopted in Indian context. People have taken different routes, and I would like to briefly mention that. For some people, philosophical thoughts, tradition, social roots, they form the worldviews, and indigenous psychology should be based on that. For some people, religion is the most critical factor, and the knowledge that exists in Vedas, Upanishad, Bhagavad Gita, our traditional religious scriptures should be the guiding force for development of indigenous psychology. Now, such knowledge also exists in other religions. Buddhism, particularly, is very rich about the study of consciousness and mental processes. For some, indigenous psychology is Hindu psychology. At the same time, there are some who think that we are the product of collective experiences, our memory that is based on folk narratives, wisdom, accumulation of common sense wisdom, accumulation of our collective experiences that should be crystallized, formulated, and provide a basis for indigenous psychology. Still, there are some who talk about socio-political, religious reform movements, and these movements have really shaped values of the Indian societies, and that should be the focus in indigenous psychology in India. So there are not one, but several kind of approaches in development of indigenous psychology in India. Now, three distinguished scholars, Professor Ramakrishna Rao, Professor Paranjape, and Professor Dalal, who put a handbook together, and they call this handbook not less than Indian psychology. they argue that Indian psychology is a reality. So as there is a Western psychology, there has to be Indian psychology. And this psychology does not grow in vacuum. It develops in the cultural context. And this Indian psychology is derived from indigenous thought system, best suited to address Indian context, specific psychological issues and problems. Now, they go on to argue that the indigenous psychology, which they call Indian psychology, would not be only true for Indian population, but would be true for other population too. So why to limit indigenous psychology only for India? In their argument, the knowledge based on indigenous psychology must find place for integration in the psychological science and applicable to other population for understanding their mind and mental processes. So they further say that there could be certain portion in indigenous psychology, which they call Indian psychology, specific to India, but there could be some other side of that that could be applicable to psychology in general, enriching possibilities of universal science. Now, this claim made in this handbook published by the Oxford has been pursued, but how far this position is acceptable is yet to be seen. Now, there are certain methods to evaluate progress in the process of indigenization of psychology in India. One is research. Indigenous research must emanate from the culture, from the context for which that indigenous knowledge is being developed. Should be culturally facilitative research practices. The practices should be culturally appropriate. The methods should be appropriate. Indigenous methodologies have to be developed, and then probably we may arrive at knowledge, and that could be applicable. So, indigenous psychology require certain conditions, and those conditions must be met. There is another issue related to evaluation, that what should be the process and progress of indigenization. One is a structural indigenization. It should lead to reorient organizational and institutional capabilities. So unless the departments of psychology and centers of psychological research commit themselves to reorient organizationally, it would be difficult to make progress. So institutional acceptance of the process is important. Then substantive indigenization, that means we need to study the society, we need to study people, economics, political institution, and those studies provide background for planning psychological research. So psychological research cannot be just isolated. It has to be part of the author's research coming from social science, various social sciences disciplines. And then there has to be theoretical progress, conceptual progress, as well as theoretical progress should be there. We must develop some meta theories reflecting socially, culturally conditioned scientific development should be possible. Indigenous psychology has progressed or not, that has to be seen. And as I mentioned, slogans making argument for particular kind of psychology is one thing, but making actual progress in real terms is something we need to understand. And I am trying to quote two enthusiasts of indigenous psychology movement, Professor Girishwar Mishra and Mohanty, that the process has been slow. It has been sporadic. And so it gets lost under the massive Western knowledge system. This should be a matter of concern. On the one hand, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are many approaches, many ways of thinking about indigenous psychology. For some, it is religion. For some, it is philosophy. For some, it is social and cultural system and context. And finally, what we find that the progress is sporadic. Let me give one example of my own department. In the early 90s, Professor Pandey and Professor Naidu, they came up with wonderful idea of non-attachment, anasakti, a kind of detachment as a coping mechanism. It was greatly appreciated, not by Indian scholars, also by Western scholars. This is very well cited study. But what happened to anasakti research? I do not see even a dozen of studies done as a follow-up. So it mere remains as an example, as one possibilities for indigenous psychology work. Well, other excellent examples of indigenous research, which cover a range of areas like cognitive affective processes, self, identity, leadership, social power, social influence, clinical practices, coping, and so on. However, there are no systematic efforts leading to paradigmatic shift, facilitating revolutionary changes in contextualizing psychological science. So on the one hand, we see a lot of enthusiasm lot of approaches, lot of efforts, but the concrete results are not there. Recently, there has been evaluation of indigenous psychology movement by others like Gustav Johorda in 2016 wrote, such decline was inevitable owing to inherent weakness in the project. Probably Professor Jahoda means that indigenous psychology did begin with great promise, but did not plan systematically, did not plan to develop scientific paradigm for research to be pursued not by one or two persons, by hundreds of scholars and make the mark. Over the period of 2 decades, with beginning in the 1980s, the literature flourished, but now it has been reduced to theoretical. So those who were enthusiastic about it, some of them are no longer with us. Some of them have aged, but following their line of work is not being seen in adequate form. Assertion that India's rich intellectual tradition has to be translated into scientific body of knowledge called Indian psychology seems to be a too ambitious kind of a statement. No path is suggested in support of assertion that universal psychology will be eventually created from indigenous psychology blooming across cultures of the world. Still, I hold the position that without indigenous psychology, universal psychology would not be possible. But indigenous psychologies also require scientific paradigm. In the last slide, I would like to mention that integrated approach of psychology may help. And one example is of JVP Sinha, who has come up with Indian mindset, representing unique features of collective experiences of religious, social practices, philosophy, folklore, socio-political reform movements, and many more, shaping their worldview, thoughts, and action. The task is difficult, and that requires that psychological science has to take an integrated systematic approach. It has to take integrated view by including all aspects of human nature, biology to socio-cultural, to understand universality and specificity of psychological process. I hope that this Congress will motivate enthusiasts of indigenous psychologies in different cultures to systematize their movement and come up with acceptable scientific paradigm for their research, leading to development of mature indigenous knowledge system, which will facilitate universal psychological science. Thank you.